is Norm Volsky, your host, and this is the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast.
Thanks, Norm. It's an honor to be here, and it's been fun to work with you over the years.
Hello, and welcome to the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast with your host, Norm Volsky. And today we are thrilled to be joined by the CEO and co-founder of Beyond Lucid Technologies. We're excited to have Jonathon Feit on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. And I was just saying before the countdown began, I'm a fan.
Oh, thank you.
So you know when they say, what is it, like first time caller or many time listener or whatever it is? I've heard your voice and your guests accompanying me on walks and long drives and with compliments to you. And I actually mean this quite seriously, and to your team. There are very few pods that I can think of that have made me stop what I'm doing so that I can take notes or screen grab where I am in the recording and write something on the screen so I can come back to it. So, yeah, reaching out was definitely you are not one who does sort of the, standard boring, you've heard them all the other places questions. And so it's a pleasure to be here and hopefully have some cool discussion and maybe have people stop whatever they're doing and take some notes and then not regret it later.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's really fun. First person I've had on the podcast with the last name that sounds like Feit, like the boxing gloves. So that's nice.
There you go.
And it's been a lot of fun to do this podcast, and I've been able to meet like a lot of I would call professional mentors, through this. So I learned just as much as the audience does, So for those of our listeners and viewers that aren't as familiar with Jonathon, Jonathon was co-founder and CEO of Beyond Lucid Technologies. For those who are not as familiar with Beyond Lucid connects ambulances and hospitals before a patient arrives, called Silicon Valley's emergency medical technology experts and winners of the 2019 Frost & Sullivan Tech Leadership Award for EMS communication. Beyond Lucid is doing some really fascinating work. Jonathon also has an MBA from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and is a California Data Exchange Framework Standards Committee member, as well as a collaborator with Congress of Mobile Medical Professionals and a contributor for EMS World. Previously, he was a columnist and podcaster for various medical journals. Jonathon is super passionate about lowering healthcare costs, getting people better access to care, and better care for even the most underserved patients, all through data transparency. And we're super excited to have Jonathon on to share his insight.
Thank you. Just to add, first of all, I still do the podcasting and the columnist for the Journal of EMS and others. So just a plug to them because they have been, so the Journal of Emergency Medical Services, EMS World Magazine, a number of trades on the health IT. So I spend about half my time in sort of EMS, fire, community paramedicine, about half it in health IT. So I've really tried to make sure that we're cross-pollinating those ideas. And just because Randy and I were talking about it, I also have some degrees from Boston University. So, Terrier pride, shout out to my people. Yeah, thanks for getting all that in there. It's funny when you hear a retrospective on things and every so often you feel like, wow, kind of did some stuff.
Yeah, you've accomplished a lot. That's why you're on. There's the heavyweights, no lightweights included. So what inspired you, Jonathon, to enter the healthcare sector?
Well, so how long we got?
We got an hour.
That's like everybody says, and I think it's quite true. There are easier ways to make a buck. And certainly when you look at mobile medicine, which is the area that we work in, it's even more complicated. So first of all, there's a couple personal aspects to that. One is you may notice I'm a twitchy guy, and a little more so today because I'm jet lagged as well.
Some allergies. I appreciate you coming on and being
nothing about that. I actually have Tourette Syndrome. And it's something I've been quite public about over many years at this point. So don't adjust your monitor. It's me, not you, I promise. But that's one of those things, when you've been on medication for a lot of your childhood and at 19 years old, uh, when you're studying things like neuropsychology and social effects and society and things, and then you get diagnosed with something, it's fascinating, right? And it kind of makes you want to understand. And I had a wonderful discussion actually just at a conference. I presented on AI in emergency medical services and fire and whatnot, which I'm sure we touch on today. And similarly, I had just gotten done running this unconference that we host, and it's the third time we did that. And I get up on stage, and I'm a twitchy guy. And it turned out, and I will get to answering your question, but this is why I talk about this, is I ended up having someone approach me afterward who is a tremendous individual, a mother, a Marine, a medic. She does, all kinds of work with underserved communities and rural environments and substance use. And she starts out by telling me that her son has Tourette syndrome as well. And she wanted to understand his position and how she could help. And so to me, that sort of got me going on wanting to understand the brain and healthcare. And my business partner has a much more tragic story, which I'll tell you in a second. But that trajectory for my career ran headlong into September 11th, 2001. And I was in Boston, which you might recall.
Originated at Logan Airport.
The planes came out of Boston. That's right. And so anyway, it was a remarkable thing. I had a friend woke me up. I'll never, one of those you'll never forget where you were moments. And it's funny to think I was actually in New York 2 days earlier. So my sister was there in school. So there was just a lot wrapped up in that. I got a phone call from a very dear friend who said the towers fell down. I thought I was dreaming. Actually, I had class at like 11 o'clock that day, and it was 9 o'clock, so I was asleep. I had no idea what she was talking about. And I remember when she explained what was going on, I actually forgot to turn on the television. Kind of fun fact. I made a couple phone calls. It was ironically, well, we can get into this, but I made a couple phone calls, and one of them was to the Army. And I had wanted to potentially serve when I was younger. I didn't love the idea of going through a military approach where, like an academy where you're not really sure. I think when you're 15, 16 years old, you don't necessarily know what you want to do with your life. Mm-hmm. But I said, if my country ever called, I would answer. And it did. And so I walked from Boston University to Government Center and enlisted in the Army. My mom says it was the single greatest diet plan she'd ever been on, because she didn't eat for a substantial amount of time afterwards. But it was a remarkable thing to begin understanding, as my military occupational specialty, MOS, was 91 Whiskey, which was a field medic. So I was actually planning on going into an EMS trajectory. Got a real chance to understand what EMS in a military environment is and what it isn't. And it ain't like it is on TV. It's actually much more like it was in Vietnam, even today. And so there's a lot of similarity with rural medicine and austere medicine and just EMS in general. You sort of go out and do whatever you can. But I have Tourette syndrome, and I actually had to go through substantial medical review and waivers, and I had to fight to get in. I mean, it was not easy to get in. And I did. And I can bore you with the story of what happened when I got to basic combat training in a minute if you want, but it's probably more detail than you want to get into today. Long story short, it turns out that my body and the United States Army don't agree. And so I left, not because of myself, actually for the safety of my colleagues and making sure that I was going to be, not put them in harm's way. It was very important, obviously, to the whole mission. But I wanted another way to serve. And so I became fascinated in going back to my roots in neuropsychology. It's actually where our company name comes from. Fun fact. Beyond Lucid, it references the broken sleep associated with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injuries. When people talk about the nightmares that warfighters and veterans suffer, also medics and firefighters and others on the line, police officers for sure, and they develop a fear of sleep. And that fear causes them to wake up a lot, right? The longer you go without sleep, the more you have health deterioration. And so I was really fascinated in the question of, could you disrupt that problem and therefore basically allow the mind to heal itself? So that's what I was working on. And my business partner, we met at Carnegie Mellon, as you mentioned. And about 2 years earlier, his father and sister had died in a car crash out near the Four Corners of New Mexico in a rural environment. And we've always known that the air crew and the ground crew and everyone who arrived really did as much as they could. And we've always said that our company is really dedicated to them. And some other people we've had close to us that have unfortunately left us. But it really was a question of what did they have access to? When you look at rural medicine, I mentioned the connection. It really is this tragic serendipity. But Chris and his family experienced in American rural environment what soldiers and warfighters experience overseas, right? And you didn't have to go far. You just go 2 states over and you see the same thing. You can go to Northern California and see the same thing. So it really was this question of how can we empower these responders to do what they need to do and enable their insights. And that's really key. And I know we want to talk about that. So the knowledge and the interoperability and the empowerment, but also enabling the next ones down the line to have that information. And from a business perspective, for all sides, to enable them to value that, right? Because one of the challenges that fire and EMS agencies are having all over the country right now, like doctors, like nurses, et cetera, is retention and hiring and staffing. And I guess those are all kind of parts of staffing, right? And equipment and reducing overtime so that they can rest and they can eat and not have aging equipment, right? And so that requires, and it's it's ironic backdrop against the United Health CEO murder, but the money flows are really important. And it turns out having an MBA plus this background puts you in an interesting position to be able to cross them over because there's so much work that gets done that's excellent clinically. But if you can't measure it, it's hard to use that to build an enterprise. And so we came in and filled this niche. And it's actually a short version of a very, very, very long story. So
Yeah.
Sorry for talking.
I would imagine. Can you walk our audience through various products that Beyond Lucid offers and how that provides better clinical health outcomes?
Yeah, sure. So our focus is on interoperability and again, empowering the responder. So it all started with the core record. So the EPCR, which is electronic patient care record, is essentially an electronic health record for an ambulance. It's for reasons that actually don't make a whole lot of sense to anybody. Instead of calling it an EHR, we call it an EPCR, but it's functionally the same thing. And there's actually one company out there that simply started calling theirs an EHR and confused a lot of people. But that's where it started. So there's a lot of standards. The mobile medical ecosystem is very complicated. And if I knew then what I know now, when we started the company, I probably would have described it to investors very differently. There was always this question, like every venture gets, and I know we'll talk today about things like profitability and I hope and whatnot for others who may be looking to go down a venture path. But there was always this really snide and offensive comment that certain people like to make. And it was things like, hey, why are you so great that I can't just hire a team in wherever and outbuild you, right? Or why can't Epic do what you're doing? I mean,
yeah,
and the answer was always, I guess. But if I know then what I know now, what I would have said is the mobile medical ecosystem has erected its own barriers to entry. It's extremely complicated from a regulatory perspective. It's very fast moving. The burdens are very high and the margins of error are very low. If you get something wrong, people die. It's not a matter of I have to go in and change my document.
It's not hyperbole to say it's life and death.
It can be. Well, and one of the things that we do to answer your question, one of the most proud things that we do is we run statewide specialty care registries. So we have this core record. That's what started it. That led to a discussion about sharing the data. So that focused on the interoperability bits. That rolled into tracking of the data. So looking at individuals who come into the ambulance a lot, whether it's chronic care management or what I call the chronically acute, which is basically people who are making themselves sick. That's things like substance use and so on. And that led to a focus on individuals who have needs that responders may not know. So for example, if you have an end-of-life medical order, or if you have a child with a condition, if you have cancer, or let's say you're involved in a car crash. And Norm, this is how emotional this stuff gets. It really is powerfully emotional. The idea that if you have a car crash where, car goes into a ditch, car hits a pole, car hits another car, whatever it is, parents, so you've got a kid in the back, maybe 2 kids in the back, parents are knocked out by the force of the crash, kid is in the back crying, but okay, gets taken out of the vehicle, extricated by fire or EMS, and they're crying, but 6 hours later, they're dead. And the reason is because nobody knew that kid was hemophiliac. And the parents weren't able to tell you. And the fact that that kind of stuff happens in 2024, the fact that you take a kid out, and again, post-crash care is a huge focus. I actually just got accepted this morning to speak at a conference in DC about it, where people are starting to ask the question, what can we do to reduce roadway injury and death? And what's really terrible is to think you've got an individual who comes out of the vehicle and say, for example, the child, maybe our size, right? I mean, they might not be a child. Maybe they're only a child on the inside. Maybe they have autism, for example, and you pull them out of the vehicle. They freak out. They bolt into the roadway. And right now you've got someone who's deceased because you didn't know, right? And it's not because you did anything wrong. It's because you acted with what you had, which goes all the way back to what I mentioned about Chris, right? And the military says. So it's sort of this through line of our career that really it's been remarkable. We're going on our 16th year in business. When I look back at the slide decks that I created in 2009, 2010, I see these words still in there. I mean, this was really for all the venture pivots that people talk about, kind of figuring out how to make it work. There's a through line, and it is for us just layers, right? So it's kind of use case on use case. Yeah. And so now we see in the marketplace with the discussions of AI and interop and Palantir and Anduril and Oracle, and we have patterned our business to some degree. I should say we were here first, but when you look at Palantir, for example, which a lot of your listeners probably know about, big data, government.
My cousin's the CFO of the company.
So you know it well.
And then we've had our eye on them for a while, because we're like, I wonder what cousin Dave's doing these days. I know he used to be a lawyer, but I think he's working for some startup. And then we saw him on MSNBC the day of the IPO. We're like, oh, that's what he's been doing.
There you go. Well, we've described ourselves as a little Palantir for some time. We were, what most of their work is federal. Most of our work is state and local because of the nature of the agencies we serve. But we just brought in this year, we brought in a Navy contract. We work at the whole state level, and it's been interesting. For years, I described our business as Twilio for emergency medical services. And it really was this idea of connecting the dots, right? You don't even necessarily know we're here, but the people who are on the ground who feel more equipped and then are able to track their patient, track themselves, which is a big focus right now, of course, is the mental wellness of the responders. For us, it's just been layer upon layer of these interoperable frameworks. And it turns out people are finally starting to care. I mean, COVID, I recently got asked by a reporter for not MSNBC, it was CNBC, but I would say another big channel, sort of what the effects of the last few years have been. And I explained mobile medicine's a contrarian business. Right? When the world falls apart, my guys go to work. COVID really sparked an enormous amount of demand. It scared a lot of people, of course, in terms of what information couldn't be shared, but it really shined a light on the need for resiliency in the healthcare system. And it's interesting. There's a lot of debate. Again, your pod is called digital health, right? But at the federal level, mobile medicine, EMS, is actually categorized as transportation. It's in the Department of Transportation, whereas the fire side is actually in Department of Homeland Security. The United States Fire Administration is related to FEMA. So there's these really interesting, they don't live in healthcare, but they clearly practice healthcare. And it turns out when it hit the fan, and with all of the climate related issues, these major storms and the crazy wildfires and COVID and all the things, being outside of healthcare has actually, I think, been really good. There's a lot of focus.
Can you explain why? What are the advantages of it not being a healthcare?
Yes.
Under that umbrella?
First of all, healthcare per se is obviously crazy political. Being, when you have a $800 billion infrastructure bill that really focuses on making sure that our roads are working and our bridges are working and the lights are working. It turns out that one way of describing mobile medicine is human infrastructure, right? When I lived in New York, I left a piece of my heart on the swinging on a pole in Midtown somewhere. But I used to describe the siren as the soundtrack of the city. You hear it all hours of day or night. And I remember intimately finding it very comforting that even while I was at home sleeping, the world was still moving and people were getting cared for and all the things, right? So when healthcare is under attack or healthcare is being questioned or healthcare is being changed, but people are looking around and saying, we're creating jobs, we're hardening our resilience, we're going to fix those roads. And oh, by the way, there's also a part of that needs to make sure they can get where they need to go on those roads. So EMS per se benefits in that way. And I think when you look on a service by service basis, you may not see it, but when you look in aggregate, it's definitely happening. And the same thing is on the fire side, right? Where you've got Homeland Security, obviously big topic. I mean, and it's going to be for a long time. But FEMA is the star, basically post Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, and Hurricane Ian, and all these, Michael, and everything that's hitting over and over. And the idea of saying we need these folks to be able to not only respond, but at this conference I was mentioning, this preparedness conference, there was a substantial discussion about family reunification. But that doesn't sound like a response to a disaster thing, right? It's not water on fire. It's not, keeping the land intact. It's the idea that there are people here and those people have needs. And in some of those cases, those people have complex needs like oxygen and medicine and insulin, right? And so if you take the folks who live near New Orleans and you move them to Houston, or you have refugees coming up through the southern border and you again, Homeland Security, right? And you move them to New York, or you move them to Minnesota or wherever, their healthcare needs go with them. And so all of these conversations around the human functions kind of, in my view, hide within these segments where if they were inside HHS, they'd be mired in conversations around vaccination and, interoperability, TEFCA and all this stuff. I mean, they're all relevant, but those are so distracting. And EMS and fire need to be able to do their jobs. Mm-hmm. And they do, because they're tucked into these places. And so I tend to try to quash those debates as fast as I can with the reality that there's not a whole lot of people out there in the world saying, I'm really glad that I get to submit stuff to CMS. That's just yay. And doctors and nurses aren't regulated by HHS. They're regulated by the states. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the regulatory frameworks operate. Fire and EMS and their ecosystems need to persist. Mm-hmm. So by them living in these other places, I think they get a bit of a reprieve at times when those areas of resiliency are unfocused. The downside is the same too, right? At some point, the infrastructure is quote unquote built. It's done for the moment. And so now the focus will turn to something else and they'll be out of the spotlight. And so that's where, for me and my organization, my partner clients, et cetera, we are really racing to capitalize on this moment. And that reflects in the business for sure. But it really is about, and this is what I've been presenting on lately, is about looking to the future. So how much can you do now? That is not about now. It's going to be about the next 5 to 10 years of innovation, so that you're prepared when you no longer have those infrastructure dollars sitting in front of you. And now you have to be able to use what you grabbed, right? So there is a bit of a scramble, but it's a scramble in a direction as opposed to just take whatever you can get. It's interesting how these lines, again, they come to a moment of urgency. And just like so much of entrepreneurship, right? It's being ready when that opportunity knocks and you're ready to grab it.
Wow, super interesting. Didn't ever really think about how these functions being governed by different departments really, impacts their ability to help people. How does Beyond Lucid help address the scourge of drug addiction? Because I think the pandemic has probably been one of the most challenging things, and I would say right now substance abuse is probably one of the biggest issues this country has.
I would agree. I also don't think it's just now. I think it's been like that for a while. I think it's terrible that the Sackler family settlement is kind of on hold, because there's a lot of people who want to start solving this problem in a practical fashion.
Yeah, and I watched the documentaries. I saw Dope Sick. I saw the other one. I forget exactly what it was called. But I watched both, and it was very disheartening.
So let me preface by saying it's so much worse than you see in the movies, right? I mean, there's not. Yeah, well, okay. So Gosh, again, we can do an entire session just on that. So, and if you really want to see me get upset and animated, by the way, take that very question and apply it to veterans. And it's a whole other thing, right? Because that's just, there's no excuse. So the substance use challenge is a lot of things. It is certainly a human tragedy. It is an information exchange failure because what we are not talking about, and you mentioned DopeSick. DopeSick's actually kind of a perfect example of this, I think. In none of these cases, or very few of these cases, are you talking about people who got hooked recreationally, right? There are people like that, for sure. But the real tragedy, and again, what makes it very personal to me, I know people, particularly know people who know people, who, for example, got injured on the job. Actually, I have very dear friends who came really close to this tragedy. Right, they get injured on the job. They needed an appointment with a orthopedist or some other specialist, and it was going to take a while to get that appointment. They just didn't, there's just a line. There's not enough of them. We know this. In the meantime, they got put on pain management regimen, and that thing bit. And they didn't know. They didn't have any warning. It took 3 days. Right. I mean, it's not like they were shooting up for weeks. Right. I mean, that's just not how it happens. So you get the oxy prescription, you take 3-4 days worth of pills, your endorphins start to adjust, and now you're in it. And you either better be able to pull yourself out, or you can get sucked down that rabbit hole and you didn't know you had that addictive personality. So it's very personal. In our world, from a company perspective, it's really about helping to identify, on the one hand, sparks of a problem. So, for example, I've done a lot of writing about San Francisco. San Francisco is about 30 miles from me. And you may have heard we have a little bit of a drug problem in San Francisco. Well, the problem as I see it, it's actually not the drug problem. The problem is the health information exchange that doesn't exist. So we have no health information exchange in the beating heart of technology for the world, which is disgusting on every level. So we have 3 911 services. There's clearly a lot of substance use in the city, but because of the lack of interoperability, it is, let's assume you're calling 911 only once a day, which there's no reason to assume that, but let's assume you can jam your hand in a motor, get in the back of an ambulance, right? Call 911, get in the back of an ambulance, be given fentanyl, highly addictive, narcotic, all the things, and super effective, right? For pain management, it's amazing. But in proper dosage, is definitely dangerous and something that's easily hooked on. And you get your fentanyl, you get to the hospital, you get cleaned up, whatever, and you're discharged. You go back to the street, you cross the street into another ambulance's district. You take a hammer, smash yourself on the hand, call 911 again, get into another service's ambulance, do the same thing again. And once a day, by the 4th day, is the first time that any of those ambulances will know that you have been seen before, because there's no communication between them. I'm stopping that problem. My team is stopping. We call it dropping a net over the region. We enable those services to see, or someone like a public health agency or a hospital, like a general hospital, trauma facility, et cetera, to see that Norm has been here from multiple services in the last few days. I can see you on one screen. That never existed. It's been now demonstrated. That's been deployed for years. We've done it in a really fascinating way in places like Massachusetts and in Oklahoma and here in California, where you can have whether it's a health information exchange or just a hospital network. Integris, for example, is the largest hospital system in Oklahoma. And we set this up for them years ago. They basically had what we all called a master account, where they could see all the transports to all their facilities on one screen. In Massachusetts, we did that with multiple agencies. So Mass General Brigham, for example, has a screen that allows them to see different fire departments, different ambulance services, and you can sort by a person. So I could see Norm. Right. Suddenly, the idea that the system doesn't lose track of you anymore. And the truth is, what's terrible is that besides everything there is that the data show, and this is where things like social determinants of health come in, right? You need to go beyond the 911. If you discharge somebody clean back into an environment, this is what happened in DopeSick, right? You discharge them back into the environment that they were. The from Alameda County, the research out of Alameda County found that the risk of death increases by integers. It's not a little, it's a lot, because your body is no longer acclimated, right? You've essentially reduced the ability to know what your tolerance is at that point. So you thought you were doing a good thing by cleaning them up, and you actually increased lethality of even the same dose as they would have had before. So we are in this horrible cycle. But for me, I don't see that as a clinical problem. I see it as a data problem. I've had people come at me with pitchforks for that. But I say these programs are not clinical in nature. You will do the medicine regardless of the nature of the problem, right? And that's what EMS and fire do. There's an emerging practice all over the country called community paramedicine, which is really about getting in front of the crisis. And I've told them that's a data question. It's a question of, do I know Norm? Do I know Norm's needs medically, socially, psychologically, housing, right? If you're living on the street and someone's going to come over to you and you're cold and you're in pain, and someone says, hey, I can help you with that, you might take it. And even if you don't want to, last time it made you feel better and your life kind of sucks right now, and you don't know when it's going to get better and you're hungry, so you're going to take it. If we arrest that problem, right? If we disrupt that problem, that's what we do. And I do it through data and interoperability. But I'm also working on, again, this was a lecture I gave earlier this week. I think we need to talk about the extent of technology. And I'm working on a forever book project on this. The current title, if you're keeping track, is called Band-Aids Over Bullet Holes. And it's really about the limits of technology, because for everything I just described and the role of data in that, I can identify that Norm has an issue. I can identify that Norm has been in an ambulance several times. I can identify that he's taking this medication rightly or wrongly. I can identify who his next of kin is. What I can't do is reverse an overdose with an app. I can't put food in your mouth with an app. Maybe someday we'll have robots to do that, but we're not there yet, right? So we need to talk seriously when we talk about investments and things like AI and so on. There is an extent to which they're helpful, an extent to which they become absurd. And that conversation's not happening yet. So there's an enormous amount of resource going into basically hogwash. I mean, just things that will not materialize to value as needed. So we expend resources that could be spent on human services, right, with hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, I don't want to pick on Forward, but Forward is kind of the topic of the day here in the health IT circles. The amount of money that they brought in to build boxes in malls for wealthy people to then not use is tragic. I mean, there's so many words. And I think to myself, did anybody actually think, again, I know you and I wanted to talk about some business fundamentals, but this really is that. Did anybody bother to think, is this a wise use of money? Mm-hmm. And if it's not, should we do it, right? It's sexy, great. It seems shiny, fantastic. You're going to disrupt One Medical, knock yourself out. You want to take down Amazon? You do that. But the idea that cash is a zero-sum game, there's not that much of it. So if it becomes a question of one versus the other, then we really need to have a conversation around, is this the wisest long-term use of that cash, as opposed to, for the next quarter or, for the next TechCrunch article. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be flashy and sort of live the Silicon Valley dream. But if it's at the expense of these services that will actually solve the problem, I think we need to have a social reckoning on that.
Yeah. Can you tell us about your HALCYON
Post-Crash Intelligence?
How do you pronounce that? How do you pronounce the product?
Yeah, HALCYON. Yeah, you got it right. Nice job. Actually, it's funny. So we announced that a couple years ago, and since then, there's like 4 or 5 different ventures, all called HALCYON. So I'm actually really enjoying it, because people are going to be Googling and finding us, and let them keep doing it. So HALCYON Post-Crash Intelligence is really directly in line with everything we've talked about here, but really focused on a different end user. So it's our magnum opus. It's a patented technology, which is awesome. That took some work. So if you think about OnStar, right, so many of your listeners will understand what OnStar is. If you've been involved in a crash, for example, OnStar and other telematic systems like it provide information about where an incident occurred, whether the airbags went off, maybe velocity of impact or penetration on the vehicle. All that's great, except they don't provide any information on who was impacted. So it goes back to the example of the child in the backseat with autism or hemophilia. Or I use my own family as an example. My father is a transplant patient. He's diabetic, and he hasn't he hasn't drawn his insulin shot or put out his medications in, like 40 years. My mom does that. And so she's his caregiver. She earns wings every day. And love you, Mom. Love you, Dad. And if they were involved in a crash, which they were about 2 years ago, they got hit head on their own street. Basically, if my mom goes, my father's dead. Like there's no question. He won't know what to give himself, right? So HALCYON is intended to close that information gap so that if responders arrive at the scene, they would have some idea of what the complex needs are, the medications, the allergies, the next of kin. Do they have an end-of-life medical order like a Pulse or a Molst in New York? What do I need to know? What's been interesting is as we've evaluated this market, and it's enormous. The auto safety market is huge. On the one hand, identified, I mentioned this got a patent, which is cool, it's not OnStar, it's something different, sort of additive to this telematic conversation. But when you look at the fleet vehicle market, that includes ambulances, that includes fire vehicles. If an ambulance is involved in a crash and someone else comes to take care of them, how many times are you going to know your colleagues' allergies or what meds they're taking? You walk around the office saying, I'm taking Coumadin today, right? Or I'm taking insulin. Here's my dosage on my insulin, right? You may know that person's diabetic, but it almost sounds ridiculous, except when one considers how many ambulance and fire services are volunteer in the United States, right? So especially in places like rural environments, you may have somebody coming out of their house at 2:00 in the morning to respond to a thing, and they get involved in a crash on the way to the hospital. They've passed through 4 towns on the way there. Those volunteers have no idea who this person even is. So wouldn't it be amazing if they could have context on that individual as well? And so our main brand has been Mediview, MEDIVIEW, Mediview. And that's a very technical brand. It's a very clinical brand. But that doesn't really work for non-medical context. So HALCYON means it's a golden bird or a beautiful day. So that's actually the name we adopted, and our tagline for it is "Here's to your beautiful tomorrow." And so sorry, I just got to chill as I say that. Like when I think about this is the part that dedicates back to Bill and Sarah Witt. This is what we wish they had. And so to us, that's really it. Sort of the collection of everything that we've done to get to this point and say, if I can put this in the hands of a responder to a scene where we talk about, responding to an ambulance or a fire vehicle or police vehicle.
Yeah.
How about a school? How about a school bus? Right. There's work being done now here in Oakland, not far from me, on connected and electric school buses. Imagine if you're a parent and your school bus was involved in a crash. Not only would you be able to know that your kid's okay or not okay. You don't want to put, clinical details in a message, but wouldn't it be amazing if you could say they were involved? They're now at the local hospital. You can come find them. Here's the room they're in. Now you don't have to run in, oh my God, where's my kid? And blah, blah, blah. You know exactly what to do, right? And the responders received information about their complex care needs, about their oxygen needs, about whatever. And so we took all of these things and we put them together in one package, and it just so happens to fit with trends right now in terms of not only post-crash care and that mandate to reduce the death rate on the roads, but also the autism rights movement, right? And the recognition that you've got, with autonomous vehicles, people are driving in computers, right? Those computers can speak to you. Mm-hmm. I have been privileged to have some conversations with autonomous driving companies to date. We are still trying to get connected with folks like Uber and Lyft, where imagine a vehicle. I took an Uber home from the airport last night, right? It knows who I am, where I'm coming from, where I'm going to, and how I'm paying. But if that Uber is caught in a crash and responders show up, they know nothing about me. They know nothing about the driver. They know nothing about how many people are even in that vehicle. And some years ago, when Uber was still only running about 8 million calls a day, which seems crazy, but they're doing a lot more now. A member of the Uber team himself said to me, if we're doing 8 million calls a day, the 1 in a million event happens 8 times a day.
Yeah.
Right? So think about the number of crashes that occur out there on the roads, and 911 is showing up and they know nothing. So they are hamstrung. They are at risk. They don't, again, goes back to the nightmares, right?
Yeah.
What would I have done if I knew? But without the ability to have that, they don't have a choice. So if you take all these different pieces and you plug them in to what's already there, information starts to flow and you can solve post-crash death. You can start, not 100%, but a lot of it. There's a lot of stats that are coming out of the feds right now about the percentage of patients who are alive when 911 showed up and they weren't when they got there, when they got to the hospital. What if you could increase that by allowing them to be prepared? But that's the same conversation about showing up to a school that's been involved in a shooting, right? We're hearing about these all the time. And if you knew that a kid had mobility issues, or we just encountered a child in Washington, D.C. who has cancer and outwardly looks fine, but because of the meds, she can't run away. So because she can't move fast enough. So if the responders knew they had to pick her up and move her, she would be at less risk. All of these bubble up to the same conversation around, do you know what you need to know before you arrive on scene?
Yeah.
And it turns out from a business standpoint, that has real value, and that value can be, brought down to numbers. And so that's sort of been the business part of what we've done.
I love it. Now you're in over 27 states and, growing from that. So it's fantastic. Oh, wow.
We're at about 33 at this point. So
very nice. Love it. Really, really glad to hear it. I ask everyone who comes on this podcast, how do you practice what you preach? You live, breathe, sleep healthcare. You're in a very high stress job, being CEO of a company that, really does save lives. So I guess my question is, how do you, have an exercise regimen, and how do you kind of protect your own psyche and mental health, and participate in wellness yourself?
I think you're going to love my answer. I hope you're going to love all your listeners should love my answer. So actually I listen to you, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
And others. You're not the only pod. I find that exercise during the day I would love to do, but I'm so distracted, whether it's email or things or kids or whatever. It's hard, but I try several times a week to do at least 2 miles or so. I live on a loop, so it helps, to 1.6 miles around. So I go out and I'll do a couple, and I throw on the most interesting pods that I can find, several of which have been digital health heavyweights. No joke, you didn't pay me to say that. No, this is real.
There's some people that use my podcast to fall asleep, so I'm glad you use it in a different way than others.
I got to tell you, man, in all seriousness, I find it inspiring. I think there's a lot of noise out there. And I think there are conversations that are being had that are actually making things worse. I don't think you need to look far. And I'm not talking about, cable news. That's its own special beast. Spoken as a journalist, it's actually really tragic for me to say. But I think the fascinating, I didn't listen to podcasts until a couple years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago. Really late to that party. But I do think that it's fascinating, and I appreciate you for and your team because of the level of depth you allow people to get into. Again, I know I talk a lot, and you had a whole list of questions, and I'm sorry that I answer as long as I do.
The most important ones, so we're very happy with the content.
It is, I think there is something to be said for recognizing that there is too much redundancy in the conversations that are being had, right? The same names are getting coverage. Their PR firms are working overdrive. And so one of the events that I do, or the event that I do, one of the things I do is we hosted the Mobile Medical Innovation Roundtable. It is an unconference. And if you're not familiar, or your audience is not familiar with an unconference, it's essentially a conference with no agenda. Yep. So everyone brings what they care about. And that is so core to my mission, this idea. And it was the same, by the way, when I published magazines. I ran a magazine called Citizen Culture for several years. It became the first all digital magazine ever produced, which was like print form. You could flip the pages and all that. So it was awesome. Whole other podcast conversation. But my pride and joy, and the reason why I did that is because I recognized that there was a need to publish new voices. And even when the magazine folded, it was and still is a point of pride that we published 86 first-time authors. That was amazing. They were never again going to be unpublished, right? And so they could kickstart their career. And I think what podcasts plus exercise does, right? It allows me to feel productive, which is nice, but I get perspectives that are different than who's sitting on the dais at the buzzy conference of the week. Mm-hmm. I want to know the stories. I hope some people will hear what I'm talking about and reach out. Please do. First name dot last name at beyondlucid.com. Just spell it right with the O-N at the end, not the A-N. That's another guy. And I think it allows us to recognize that whether you call it a tapestry or you call it a mosaic, whatever it is, there are so many people working on amazing things, and healthcare is complicated. There's a podcast out there called Healthcare is Hard. It's a neat podcast, but I actually don't buy into that thesis. I don't think it's any harder than any other business. Try building in finance, try building in auto, try building in whatever. I mean, it's all complicated, or it's all hard, but healthcare is complicated. A lot of pieces. And their regulatory and their safety and their technology and their science and all the things and engineering. So I want to hear what other people are doing because I probably need that. And there's not a lot of forums. And so the podcast ecosystem, and particularly the ones that are focusing on under-addressed folks that are not like, did you raise this week? Who cares? And so you guys have been doing that. I really appreciate it. And it helps me kind of get out of my daily bubble while at the same time not being, sometimes I'll listen to Marketplace or I'll listen to music, but really I find it very enjoyable to hear the perspectives of other people and try to take a couple things back every night and have it frame my next day. Mm-hmm. And with your series, I've gotten more of that per listen than I think any other series that I can recall. So that was why I wanted to reach out. So
touching, and thank you. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to get your perspective. And I think a lot of people that listen are going to love your perspective and understand that. But this is a huge, huge part of the healthcare ecosystem. Last question is any favorite recipes? I think what we put into our bodies is ultimately a huge determining factor of our overall health. And I think some of the times, it's just a little bit difficult to brainstorm, like, oh, what can I try? What should I do? So sometimes you sharing a recipe gives someone the inspiration to try something new.
Okay, so I'm gonna answer and non-answer your question at the same time. Please. So first of all, Instagram, not a huge user for other reasons, but as a food porn repository, unbelievable. The food porn on Instagram is incredible. So I'm actually veganish. Mm-hmm. Short version of a story, familially high cholesterol. It just got presented with an ultimatum from my doctor a couple years ago that I'm either going to be pills for the rest of my life or change how I eat.
I got a similar shock to the system about 6-7 years ago. So yeah.
So, well, I'll tell you, I'm not fully vegan. I actually went too far in that direction. I had to come back and basically more like pescatarian. But I think something that people don't really think about is that it is interestingly enjoyable to go that route. It's hard, but if you eat meat and you eat cheese and you eat ice cream and all the things on a regular basis, like anything you do all the time, they kind of get old, yes. Right? And so I found when I'll go out to an event or I'll go out on a date with my wife or something special and have something that I wouldn't usually have, you enjoy it. So if I would encourage, I know it's not a specific recipe, but more the idea that if you pull back on some of those things that are the what?
The indulgences.
Actually, that's the word I was going for. Thank you for that. You pull back on that a little bit and try to have, like the amuse-bouche, the French approach where it's a small taste or whatever. It's weird. I never thought I would enjoy it that much. Because, my God, in American food, we have meat and milk and cheese and mayonnaise and all kinds of things. It becomes so nice. The other day at this conference, we have, pastas and risottos and stuff. And you have a little bit of it. It's, oh, my God, this is, again, the 3-star meals, right? The 3-star Michelins, they're little. They're not massive steaks. And so I guess, to me, it's almost any of these things. My wellness, and food is about moderation, which again, my mother will love that I just said that, but she says that's her favorite word. But it really was to reconsider the quantity of those indulgences, as you say, that we have, because then when you do, you feel it like coffee. When you haven't had coffee for 2 months and then you have it, like, hey, I'm awake again. Yeah. So that's what I would say. How's that for a non-answer at length?
Incredible. Really, really good. Well, again, Jonathan, thank you for joining us on the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast. Really excited about what you and Beyond Lucid have done in the space, and excited to continue to watch what you do more. So thank you so much, and continue to do the great things and fight the good fight.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Norman. Thank you to your team. Take care.
Thank you for joining. Please like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed it.